vlog. We are traveling. I'm Taylor Hendricks, a PhD student. This is Britta. She is a master's student, and you all know Dr. Dennis Hancock, the Grassman at University of Georgia. So we are just going to talk to you a little bit about our travels that we have been on this week.
So where have we been this week?
Well, this week we traveled up to Ohio, the land of the north and cold.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
It's been pretty dreary, but we were at an intensive Alfalfa Training Seminar. We were visited from faculty from across the United States, including those from Wisconsin, Michigan, of course our own from Georgia as well, and learned a lot about different production systems that they're going on in Ohio and the northern states, of course, focusing on some dairy production and using alfalfa in those systems, as well as a lot of seed development, production throughout the alfalfa system, and then on down through feeding and introducing it into animal diets and programs. So
I think you can tell they're pretty excited about alfalfa after 3 days of it.
Yeah.
So tell me, ladies, what were some of the things that you learned? What did you get the most out of this week during the seminars?
For me, I think just getting to see the whole system. You know, we started off with very basic physiology, establishment, and then kind of taking it through the entire process. Each of the talks built on something else. So it went from just, seed development to establishment to feeding and harvesting all the way through the economic portion. That was big for me.
What about you, Britta?
Absolutely. I did not come from any kind of alfalfa background, so it was all pretty new to me. But I think the biggest change we were discussing earlier in the car, we were leaving, that a lot of the influences of the alfalfa production around here is obviously focused more towards dairy and row crop monoculture, where they're doing corn silage and introducing alfalfa into those systems, especially as a nitrogen fixation aspect and reducing their fertilization costs. So it was interesting to see a different kind of production system in that aspect, and especially working with Taylor and her studies looking at interseeded mixes. Definitely this week was more of a focus on pure stand alfalfa and looking to see what we could do there. And there was a lot of new information I received, especially from, what was the guy's name that worked for USDA?
Neil Martin.
Neil Martin. Dr. Neil Martin had some interesting information about some new technology using alfalfa in biofuels and all kinds of things. So it's definitely a broad range of topics that we discussed.
So I think both of your all's research is very, alfalfa's at the heart of it. So I think your attendance here has probably really been helpful to you. Kind of tell me how some of that relates to your research and what maybe you picked up from these meetings that kind of relates to your research.
So for me, one huge component of the research that I'm doing is looking at some different inoculants when you're actually harvesting the alfalfa for baleage. So getting to have a little bit more of an in-depth discussion and kind of hearing lectures on how the different microbial inoculants and the different preservatives are being used and what they can be used for has helped me to have a better understanding of what exactly I'm looking at when I'm doing some of the production.
Yeah, so my research is in pure stand small plots down in Tifton, so it was a lot different to see the way they're doing things up here in the different soils. But we did discuss quite a bit about fertility and some about potassium fertilization, which is a huge component of my research, as well as the harvesting schedules, which something that never dawned on me, maybe because it's not as common in the southeast, was the contract harvesting, which we talked a lot about today. And I was surprised at how economical that was, really, and how it makes so much more sense, at least if you have contract harvesters obviously in your area. But that was definitely interesting in talking to people who grow alfalfa on pure stand like I do, and how some of the newer research on the different harvest intervals and bloom and the physiology behind the digestibility at different bloom stages and maturity stages is impacted, and how that can help us in our feeding programs for sure.
So what are some of the other things that you learned that were a surprise to you, or that was kind of new and novel to you?
For me, it was really, we had a lecture this morning on using alfalfa in dairy feeding strategies, feeding programs. And I was kind of surprised when we were looking at the breakdown of the value of that alfalfa for feed, that, you know, a lot of times thinking about forages, we want to try and minimize the fiber, minimize that, and that's not always the best thing in these strategies. There's kind of like a more of an optimum range instead of just kind of trying to minimize that. And then also thinking about the crude protein that's in the alfalfa, and how sometimes crude protein does not necessarily mean the best protein, because it's not always as efficient.
Yeah, did y'all get that about the value of that protein being a little different in alfalfa, that the metabolizable protein of alfalfa is a little bit lower actually than some other forms?
Yeah.
So explain that a little bit. Why is that the case? And specifically in dairy rations, I think is really more of an important thing.
You tell us you're going to ask us this. Are you talking about in terms of comparable to supplements? Or?
Yeah, compared to, like, he was talking about the comparison between soybean meal, you know, and why is it that soybean meal as a protein source is maybe just a little bit more valuable sometimes than alfalfa? What's the difference? What makes that protein more or less valuable?
All right.
I'll test your memory.
Okay. Well, I think there was some discussion on not just protein, but different sources of energy in terms of, obviously there's going to be a sink with the microbial population having to break down that forage material, whereas it's more readily available when you just feed it a concentrate. So I realize that's usually for energy sources, obviously, but I would think there's some component of that towards protein, and then
well, is all protein digestible? All the crude protein that's in any feed, is all of that actually going to be digestible and utilized?
Well, not necessarily. I know a good portion of it goes to, obviously we discuss rumen undegradable protein, and that is definitely an advantage sometimes, so that that can be passed on and be used for the cow, not just the microbial population. So.
Right, and the point is that soybean meal sometimes has, well, all the time, soybean meal has more rumen bypass protein or rumen undegradable protein that isn't readily available in the rumen, so it actually passes by and it ends up being more digestible in the small intestine, right? Whereas with alfalfa, much more of that is rumen degradable, and so it's more readily available in the rumen. And in a dairy diet, you want a little bit more rumen undegradable protein. You want more of that to be absorbed in the small intestine rather than converted over into bacteria that will then be digested later on. You'd rather have a little bit more rumen undegradable protein. So that's why alfalfa, when we talk about it being high in crude protein, which it certainly is, and it's a great protein source, but it's not as good of a source of protein as, say, soybean meal or canola meal or something like that. So, but the big thing is that we're feeding it, as Taylor was talking about, in the dairy diet, we're also really concerned about effective NDF. We're looking for scratch factor, for fiber factor in that diet to really promote good digestion, and also to kind of offset some of the problems that we can get inside of the rumen of that cow, right? So what are some of the other things that you thought were kind of new or different, something that you learned or thought was one way actually turned out it was another way?
Well, something I hadn't not thought about, and I told Dr. Hancock earlier I was almost a little embarrassed that I had not thought about this, but obviously in the southeast it takes us a little bit longer to get the hay up because of our humid conditions and weather, but when you're leaving that hay out there, or if you have to go out to do anything else to the field after you've cut it, you're actually effectively trampling that regrowth and hurting your yield and your stand further, obviously immediately, and then further on down the line. And I never really considered that if you have to go back into the field to spray, or to if you have to go back and harvest later, or not harvest, bale or anything like that, you're really severely affecting those forages and all that grass and the alfalfa out there. But also consideration of having larger equipment too, and that was a discussion that came up in doing contract harvesting, because sometimes they have better equipment, larger equipment, and that way you're reducing that wheel traffic and allowing your legumes to get more growth and more productivity on that land. I never thought about that before.
Yeah. If you're mowing that hay with a 30-foot mower, and you're coming back with a really large rotary rake and a merger, or something that's going to cover more ground, more throughput, higher efficiency, field efficiency with the equipment, and it also means you're running over that land a lot less frequently. And the statistic that kind of still sets out in my mind is that many plants are driven over as many times as 10 times per year, just because of the repeated traffic patterns within a field. And that can have a very detrimental effect on those plants and their productivity. What about you, Taylor? What did you have as take homes? Yes.
I think for me it was kind of nice to see that management is still really key, and that alfalfa can have a lot of benefits when you manage it properly. Everything from how it can affect the soil and adding the nitrogen to the soil. In some of the crop rotations that I hadn't thought about really is using alfalfa in a rotation with corn, to having it just as alfalfa as feed. A lot of it really does come back to management and how you're taking care of your stand.
Yep. Well, and we talked a lot about quality and the value of that quality too, but I mean, one thing that is sometimes lost is what? We're looking at what is the primary driver of economic performance in an alfalfa field?
Yield.
It's yield, right?
Yield. Yep.
One of the analogies that I gave during the session was about James Carville during the Bill Clinton election, and he was famous for saying, "It's about the economy, stupid." Well, when it gets to alfalfa management, it's about the yield, stupid. You got to really
get a good picture of that slide.
So, but anyway, I think our young ladies here have a few questions for me that they've been saving up. So
I should have made them harder.
So go ahead, fire away.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So on the topic of alfalfa, obviously, as we mentioned earlier, we talked a lot about row crop situations, doing corn, coming in with alfalfa on a rotation and growing it as a pure stand. But in Georgia, obviously, we don't have a lot of that in our production systems. And with Taylor's study, we're looking a lot at Bermuda grass mixtures. And I had a lot of questions at the Ag Expo last month about seeding into Bermuda grass. So my question to you, Dennis, is how can we or is it possible, I guess this is kind of a loaded question, but is it possible for us to grow alfalfa in a mixture and grow it cheaper and with the same effective supplementation as we would for a concentrate mix in a beef cow-calf situation like we'd have in Georgia?
Well, I see a role for alfalfa in both the dairy and the beef cattle side and the southeast in general, especially in Georgia. And kind of to talk a little bit about the dairy side first, is that the reality is that we do need a rotation crop with corn. We do grow a lot of corn for corn silage for our dairies, and oftentimes after repeated years and years of continuous corn in those same fields, even if we're triple cropping and getting some rotation benefit of that, but there's still a benefit for rotating in alfalfa. there is just some real substantial improvements in corn yield. You know, the old timers would call that magic, but the reality is following alfalfa with corn, there's huge yield increases, and a lot of it has to do with the added nitrogen that's still residual in the soil. And one of the things that I learned personally was that nitrogen benefit is not only realized in that first year after, but multiple years after the alfalfa comes out. But, you know, specifically getting back to your comment about the beef cattle side of things, I really see alfalfa and Bermuda grass, for example, as being a win-win-win for everyone involved there. Maybe except for the fertilizer dealer. They may not be selling as much fertilizer for us. But the reality is that we can grow our own nitrogen. We can grow that alfalfa in Bermuda grass, and we'll just have to call him back later. We can put that into Bermuda grass and get 200, 300 units worth of nitrogen every year, have the same yield. And, you know, Taylor, from a lot of the work that you're seeing, we're actually seeing even more yields.
Yeah.
And then plus, you know, you're not putting on the nitrogen. You've got much higher quality. You're turning off something that is straight up rocket fuel in some of those mixtures of alfalfa and Bermuda grass. And, you know, that shows when it comes time to actually feed that to the animal. It shows in body condition scores. It shows in pregnancy rates, and then ultimately in the beef cattle side of things on cow-calf, you know, it shows up as calving rates and having much better calving rates as a result. So I really see it as a real win-win. Now, it does take more management, right? I mean, it does take a lot more input than straight up Bermuda grass. It's easy to go out there with fertilizer and keep Bermuda grass growing, but it's much more, you know, you have to be dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's to do a really good job of growing alfalfa and Bermuda grass. And of course, not every site is going to be suitable to growing alfalfa either, so that's another concern too. But yeah, that's a great question.
Awesome.
Well, I think my question, which you started to cheat on a little bit and steal my thunder. So my question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge to get a producer to start to consider Bermuda grass or start to put that into their production system?
Alfalfa.
You're talking Bermuda grass, but alfalfa.
Yeah, you know, I think the biggest thing is that a lot of folks listen too much to the chatter, and they bought into this idea that alfalfa won't grow in the South, and that's a bunch of bull, because it certainly can, and you two definitely can attest to that.
It grows in Tifton, I promise.
Yes.
It grows in Tifton, it grows in northwest Georgia, it grows in northeast Georgia, it grows everywhere in the state of Georgia, except for some of the swampy ground that we can get into in some areas. But, you know, if it's a well-drained site, which normally that's where Bermuda grass is going to be anyway, and if it's not just right next door to a wildlife management area and you don't have so little land of alfalfa that you don't have the world's largest food plot, then you're probably going to be just fine. It really is something that can be grown on a variety of different areas, and we've got some varieties now that are extremely well suited to our area with Bulldog 505, Bulldog 805, and Alpha Graze 600RR, and there's even some reduced lignin varieties that are in the works. So, you know, I think there's some real opportunities to interseed it in. It most certainly will grow in the South. Probably the next most challenging thing is you know, having the management time to put into it, and not everybody has that kind of time. Certainly that's the reality. A lot of folks have off-farm employment or are busy doing something else, may not be able to put in the time and effort it requires to do that. I think to some degree that's where some of that contract harvesting, contract growing can kind of come into play as well. So, yeah, I think that once you get kind of past those reservations, and you realize all of a sudden when you start really looking at the economics of it, it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And dollars too, by the way.
Dad jokes.
What else you got? Is that it?
Yeah, I think
For
so.
alfalfa?
For alfalfa.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll do another episode here in just a little bit on some other kinds of things that have come up in our, what is it, about 11-hour drive.
Something like that.
And it'll be another 11 hours back. So we'll address those in another video. One other thing, we're probably going to post some of our materials, and specifically I have a recording of the economics talk that I'm going to present. And that's a little bit broader for the whole of the alfalfa industry, looking at Roundup Ready alfalfa versus conventional alfalfa versus the Roundup Ready plus reduced lignin alfalfa as well. So I'll post that up on the web here before too terribly long as well. So I guess that will be it.
Yep.
Thank you, ladies.
Yep.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. See ya.